The sand felt cold beneath Staff Sergeant Maria Santos as she pressed her body against the rocky outcrop, her sniper rifle steady in her hands. The Afghanistan mountains stretched endlessly before her, painted in shades of brown and gray under the harsh morning sun. 3 years of deployments had taught her to read these hills like a book, but today something felt different. The silence was too perfect, too calculated. Her radio crackled softly in her ear. "Overwatch, this is Alpha Team. We're moving to the village now." The voice belonged to Lieutenant Jake Morrison, a good man who reminded her of her younger brother back in Texas. 92 souls made up their extended unit across this region, and Maria had watched over many of them through her scope during countless missions. Through her rifle's lens, she could see the small Afghan village nestled in the valley below. Mud brick houses clustered together like sleeping animals, their flat roofs catching the early light. Intelligence reports suggested this was just another routine patrol, checking on the local population and gathering information about recent Taliban movements in the, area. Maria had earned her reputation as one of the finest snipers in the Navy SEALs through patience and precision. Growing up hunting deer with her grandfather in the Texas Hill Country had given her steady hands and sharp eyes, but the military had honed those skills into something deadly and exact. She could put a bullet through a target from over a mile away, and her record proved it. The village appeared peaceful as Alpha Team approached. Women in colorful scarves moved between buildings, children played in the dusty streets, and old men sat in whatever shade they could find. It looked like 100 other villages Maria had observed during her tours. But something nagged at her, an instinct developed through years of keeping her teammates alive. She adjusted her scope and swept the area methodically. Every rooftop, every window, every shadow that could hide a threat. Her training had taught her that the most dangerous attacks often came from the places that seemed safest. The enemy had learned to use the appearance of normalcy as their greatest weapon. "Overwatch, we're at the village perimeter," Morrison's voice came through again. "Everything looks quiet down here." Maria keyed her radio. "Copy that, Alpha. I've got eyes on you. Stay sharp." Through her scope, she watched Morrison's team move with practiced caution. 8 men in full combat gear, weapons ready but not threatening, approaching the village elder who had come out to meet them. This was how it was supposed to work, building trust with the local population while gathering intelligence about insurgent activities. But Maria's grandmother had always told her to trust her gut, and right now her gut was screaming that something was wrong. The children in the village had stopped playing. The women had disappeared too quickly. Even the dog seemed nervous, skulking away from the approaching soldiers. She shifted her position slightly, getting a better angle on the village center, where Morrison's team was now talking with several local men. The conversation appeared friendly enough through her scope, hands gesturing peacefully, no obvious weapons visible. Yet the feeling of wrongness continued to grow in her chest like a cold stone. Years of combat had taught Maria that the enemy rarely announced themselves with obvious displays of hostility. The Taliban had learned to be patient, to wait for the perfect moment when American forces were relaxed and confident. They had studied American tactics and developed counters that were devastatingly effective. She began another sweep of the surrounding area, this time looking for anything unusual. A piece of metal that caught the sunlight wrong. A shadow that didn't match the object casting it. Movement where there should be stillness. Her scope moved slowly and deliberately across the landscape, checking every possible hiding spot within range of the village. That's when she saw it. Just a glint of reflected light from a ridge about 800 meters away. Most people would have missed it entirely, but Maria's trained eye caught the brief flash. Someone else was watching the village, someone with optics of their own. Her blood went cold as she realized what that meant. The friendly meeting in the village center wasn't random. It was bait. Morrison's team was walking into a carefully planned trap, and she might be the only one who could see it coming. Her finger moved to her radio, but before she could key it, she spotted another reflection from a different position, then another. The village was surrounded by hidden snipers, all of them positioned to create a killing field with no escape routes. Morrison's team was in the center of what would become their own tomb if Maria didn't act fast. Her heart pounded as she calculated distances and angles, trying to figure out how many enemy shooters were out there and where they were positioned. Through her scope, she could see Morrison laughing at something one of the village elders had said. His team was relaxed, confident in their security. They had no idea that death was watching them from multiple directions, waiting for the signal to unleash hell. Maria had perhaps seconds to make a decision that would determine whether her friends lived or died. The weight of 92 lives pressed down on her shoulders as she prepared to engage an unknown number of enemy snipers. She thought of her grandmother's words about trusting her instincts, of her grandfather's lessons about patience and precision, of every fallen comrade who had died because someone failed to see the danger in time. Today she would not fail. Maria's finger hovered over her radio as she counted the enemy positions. 4 confirmed sniper locations, possibly more. Each one had a clear line of sight to the village center where Morrison's team stood completely exposed. Her training kicked in, years of preparation condensing into this single moment of crystal clarity. Alpha Team, this is Overwatch, she whispered into her radio, keeping her voice calm despite the adrenaline flooding her system. You have multiple hostile snipers in Overwatch positions. Do not acknowledge this transmission. Continue your conversation normally and prepare to move on my mark. Through her scope, she saw Morrison's body tense slightly, but he kept talking to the village elder as if nothing had changed. Good man. His team would need every second of surprise she could give them. Maria had to make an impossible choice. She could engage the enemy snipers, but the moment she fired her first shot, the others would know their ambush had been discovered. They would immediately open fire on Morrison's team. Or she could try to warn the team to move first. But that would give the snipers time to adjust their aim and follow the retreating soldiers. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her memory. When you're hunting dangerous prey, you only get one shot to make things right. Miss and everything goes to hell. She chose the most distant sniper first, the one positioned on the ridge 800 meters away. If she could take him out silently, she might be able to work her way through the others before they realized what was happening. Her breathing slowed to match her heartbeat as she lined up the shot. The crosshairs settled on the enemy sniper's head. She could see him clearly now. A bearded man in traditional Afghan clothing with a Soviet-era rifle. He was focused entirely on Morrison's team, finger on his trigger, waiting for some predetermined signal to begin the massacre. Maria pulled her trigger. The bullet traveled nearly a full second before finding its target. Through her scope, she saw the enemy sniper slump forward, his weapon clattering against the rocks. One down, at least 3 to go. She immediately shifted to the second position, a cluster of rocks about 600 meters to the southeast. This sniper had heard the distant crack of her rifle and was scanning the hills trying to locate her position. She had perhaps 10 seconds before he spotted her muzzle flash location. The second shot was harder. The target was moving, sweeping his rifle back and forth as he searched for threats. Maria had to lead her shot, calculating where he would be when the bullet arrived. She squeezed the trigger just as he paused to scan her section of the ridge. Another hit. The second sniper dropped out of sight behind his cover. But now the remaining snipers knew they were under attack. Maria saw muzzle flashes from 2 different positions as they opened fire on Morrison's team in the village below. Her heart stopped as she watched her friends scatter for cover, bullets kicking up dust around their feet. Alpha Team, move now, she shouted into her radio. Multiple snipers, northwest and northeast ridges. Morrison's voice came back tense but controlled. We're taking fire from multiple positions. Charlie is down, repeat, Charlie is down. Maria's blood turned to ice. Charlie was Corporal David Chen, a 22-year-old kid from California who always shared pictures of his girlfriend back home. Through her scope, she could see him lying motionless in the village center while his teammates tried desperately to reach him under heavy fire. The third enemy sniper was positioned behind a large boulder about 700 meters away. He had a clear shot at anyone trying to help Chen, and he was using that advantage to keep Morrison's team pinned down. Maria could see the tactical situation developing into a nightmare. Her friends were trapped in a killing zone with limited cover, and more enemy reinforcements could arrive at any moment. She lined up her shot on the third sniper, but he was well protected behind his boulder, only exposing himself for brief moments to fire. Maria would have to time her shot perfectly, catching him in the instant when he leaned out to engage her team. Through her scope, she watched him prepare for another shot. His rifle barrel appeared first, then his shoulder, then part of his head. Maria fired the moment she had a clear target. The bullet struck the boulder inches from his face, sending rock fragments flying. Close but not close enough. The sniper jerked back behind cover, now fully aware of her position. She could see him repositioning, trying to get an angle on her while maintaining his ability to pin down Morrison's team. The fourth sniper was still firing on her friends below. From her vantage point, Maria could see Sergeant Mike Rodriguez trying to low-crawl toward Chen's position, using what little cover the village offered. Every few seconds, enemy bullets would force him to freeze and press himself against whatever protection he could find. Maria knew she was running out of time. The longer this firefight continued, the more likely it became that enemy reinforcements would arrive. She had to eliminate the remaining threats quickly and give her team a chance to escape with their wounded. She took aim at the fourth sniper's position, a small depression in the ridge about 500 meters away. This one was smart, only exposing himself for brief moments before ducking back down. Maria would have to anticipate his movement pattern and take a shot that seemed impossible. The sniper popped up to fire again. Maria led her shot, aiming for where he would be rather than where he was. Her bullet caught him in the chest just as he was preparing to duck back down. Through her scope, she saw him fall backward and disappear from view. 3 confirmed kills, but she couldn't be sure about the second one. And there might be more enemy positions she hadn't spotted yet. Below in the village, Morrison's team was still pinned down, unable to safely reach Chen or evacuate to a better position. Maria's radio crackled with Morrison's voice. "Overwatch, we need immediate extraction. Charlie's in bad shape and we've got movement in the surrounding hills. Looks like more hostiles incoming." Through her scope, Maria could see what Morrison was talking about. Dust clouds in the distance suggested vehicles approaching the village from multiple directions. The ambush had been even larger than she initially realized. Her team was about to be surrounded by overwhelming enemy forces, and she was the only thing standing between them and complete annihilation. The dust clouds were getting closer, and Maria could now make out the shapes of pickup trucks and motorcycles carrying armed fighters toward the village. She estimated at least 30 enemy combatants converging on Morrison's position. Her 8-man team was about to face impossible odds, and their only hope of survival lay in her ability to thin out the enemy ranks before they reached the village. Maria shifted her position to get a better angle on the approaching vehicles. The lead truck was still over 1,000 meters away, pushing the limits of her rifle's effective range, but she had made impossible shots before. She calculated wind speed, bullet drop, and target movement as the truck bounced over the rough terrain. Her first shot at the moving vehicle missed, striking the ground just ahead of the front bumper. The truck swerved violently but kept coming. The second shot found its mark, taking out the driver. The truck veered off course and rolled down a steep embankment, throwing its passengers into the rocks below. But there were too many vehicles, coming from too many directions. Even with her exceptional marksmanship, Maria couldn't stop them all. She needed to make every shot count and hope that Morrison's team could find a way to break contact before being completely surrounded. "Alpha Team, you've got approximately 30 hostiles approaching from the north and east," she reported into her radio. "Eat at 3 minutes. You need to move now." Morrison's voice came back strained. "Working on it, Overwatch. Charlie's unconscious but breathing. We're trying to rig a stretcher." Through her scope, Maria watched Rodriguez and another soldier, Private Jackson, attempting to fashion a makeshift stretcher from their gear, while under sporadic fire from the remaining enemy positions. Every few seconds they had to stop and take cover as bullets cracked overhead. Maria engaged another approaching vehicle, this time a motorcycle carrying 2 fighters. Her bullet took out the driver, sending the bike sliding across the rocky ground. But for every target she eliminated, more seemed to appear on the horizon. The enemy had planned this ambush carefully, with multiple waves of reinforcements ready to overwhelm any American response. She could see Morrison making hard decisions below. The team leader was weighing their options: try to carry Chen and risk everyone being overrun, or leave him behind to save the rest of the team. Maria knew Morrison would never abandon a wounded soldier, even if it meant sacrificing himself and everyone else. That's when she made her decision. "Alpha Team, this is Overwatch," she said into her radio, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. "I'm going to provide you with continuous covering fire. When I start shooting, you move Chen and get to the extraction point. Don't stop, don't look back." "Negative, Overwatch," Morrison replied immediately. "We don't leave our people behind." "That includes you?" Maria smiled grimly as she chambered another round. "I'm not planning on being left behind, Lieutenant. Just giving you a head start." She began engaging targets systematically, starting with the closest threats and working her way outward. Each shot was carefully aimed and precisely executed, Enemy fighters diving for cover behind rocks and vehicles. A sniper trying to reposition to get a better angle on Morrison's team. A machine gunner setting up his weapon on the back of a truck. Through her scope, she could see Morrison's team finally beginning to move. Rodriguez and Jackson had Chen on the improvised stretcher and were carrying him toward the village's edge where they could reach better cover. The other team members provided security, their rifles trained on potential threat areas as they moved. But Maria's covering fire had revealed her position to every enemy fighter in the area. Bullets began striking the rocks around her, sending chips of stone flying. She had to constantly shift her position to avoid being pinned down, all while maintaining accurate fire on the approaching enemy forces. One of the trucks had made it to the village outskirts and was disgorging fighters who immediately began pursuing Morrison's team. Maria engaged them one by one, but there were too many targets and not enough time. She could see her friend struggling with Chen's stretcher over the rough terrain, moving far too slowly to escape the pursuing enemy forces. Her radio crackled with Rodriguez's voice. "Overwatch, we're taking heavy fire. Multiple hostiles closing on our position." Through her scope, Maria could see the tactical situation deteriorating rapidly. Morrison's team was caught in open ground between the village and the nearest cover, burdened by their wounded teammate and pursued by numerically superior enemy forces. They were maybe 200 meters from safety, but it might as well have been 2 miles given their current circumstances. That's when Maria spotted the one target that could change everything. An enemy commander was positioned on a ridge overlooking the chase, directing his fighters with hand signals and radio communications. He was coordinating the pursuit, telling his men where to go and how to cut off Morrison's escape routes. The shot was over 900 meters, uphill, with swirling wind conditions. The target was partially concealed behind rocks and constantly moving as he gestured to his subordinates. It was the kind of shot that even experienced snipers would consider nearly impossible under combat conditions. Maria steadied her breathing and calculated every variable she could think of. Wind speed and direction, bullet trajectory, target movement patterns, the slight tremor in her hands from adrenaline and fatigue. She had one chance to make this work, one opportunity to give her friends the advantage they needed to escape. Through her scope, she watched the enemy commander raise his radio to his mouth, preparing to give new orders to his pursuing fighters. In that moment, he was stationary, focused on his communications rather than his own security. Maria took the shot. The bullet traveled for what seemed like an eternity before finding its target. Through her scope, she saw the enemy commander drop his radio and collapse behind his cover. Within seconds, the coordinated pursuit began to fall, apart as individual fighters lost contact with their leadership and started making their own decisions about how to proceed. The confusion bought Morrison's team precious time, but they were still far from safe. Enemy fighters were still pursuing them, and Maria could see more vehicles approaching from the north. She had perhaps bought her friends a few minutes, but the overall situation remained desperate. Her radio crackled with Morrison's voice. "Overwatch, whatever you just did, it worked. We're making progress toward the extraction point, but we're still taking fire. How copy?" Maria keyed her mic while chambering another round. "Copy that, Alpha. Keep moving. I'll cover your movement as long as I can." But even as she said it, Maria knew her ammunition was running low, and the enemy was beginning to locate her position with increasing accuracy. Bullets were striking closer and closer to her hide site, forcing her to constantly relocate to avoid being overwhelmed. Maria's ammunition count was down to 15 rounds, and the enemy was closing in on her position from multiple directions. She could hear voices getting closer, speaking in Pashto as fighters coordinated their search for the American sniper who had been decimating their ranks. They knew approximately where she was hiding, and it was only a matter of time before they found her exact location. Through her scope, she could see Morrison's team making good progress toward the extraction point, a small clearing about 500 meters from the village where helicopters could safely land. Chen was still unconscious on the stretcher, but Rodriguez and Jackson were moving with determined efficiency despite their heavy burden. The problem was the enemy fighters, who had broken off from the main pursuit and were now trying to circle around to cut off the team's escape route. Maria could see them moving through the terrain, using natural cover to approach the extraction point from a different angle. If they reached it first, Morrison's team would be trapped. She had a choice to make: Stay in her current position and continue providing covering fire for the team's withdrawal, or abandon her hide site and try to reach a position where she could interdict the flanking enemy forces. Either way carried enormous risks, but only one option gave her friends a real chance of survival. Maria began packing her gear with practiced efficiency. Every movement was deliberate and quiet, designed to avoid attracting attention from the enemy fighters who were now less than 200 meters from her position. She could hear them calling to each other, coordinating their search pattern as they worked their way up the ridge toward her. She slung her rifle across her back and began moving carefully down the reverse slope of the ridge, using the terrain to mask her movement from the pursuing enemy forces. Every step had to be planned and executed perfectly. A single loose rock or snapping branch could give away her position and bring overwhelming enemy fire down on her head. The new position she was trying to reach was a small cluster of boulders about 400 meters away that would give her line of sight to the extraction point and the flanking enemy forces, but getting there meant crossing open ground that would leave her exposed for several crucial minutes. Behind her, she could hear the enemy fighters reaching her former hide site. Angry voices rose as they discovered the empty position and realized their quarry had escaped. They would spread out now, searching in all directions, making Maria's movement even more dangerous. She reached the edge of the open ground and paused to assess the situation. 300 meters of rocky terrain with minimal cover stretched between her current position and her objective. Enemy fighters were visible on the ridge behind her, and more were approaching the extraction point from the north. Morrison's team was still 200 meters away from the landing zone, struggling over difficult terrain with their wounded teammate. Maria took a deep breath and started running. The first 50 meters passed without incident, her feet finding purchase on the loose rocks as she moved as quickly as silence would allow. But then a shout rose from the ridge behind her. One of the enemy fighters had spotted her movement across the open ground. Rifle fire erupted from multiple positions as the enemy fighters tried to bring her down. Bullets cracked overhead and sparked off the rocks around her feet. Maria zigzagged as she ran, using every piece of natural cover available, while maintaining her speed toward the boulder cluster. A bullet tugged at her sleeve. Another kicked up dust inches from her boots. She dove behind a small outcrop of rock just as a concentrated volley of enemy fire swept across her previous position. The cover was minimal, barely large enough to shield her body, but it gave her a moment to catch her breath and assess the situation. The enemy fighters on the ridge were now fully focused on her, which meant they weren't pursuing Morrison's team anymore. That was good news. The bad news was that she was pinned down in the middle of open ground with at least a dozen hostile shooters trying to kill her. Maria keyed her radio. Alpha Team, the heat's off you for the moment. Enemies focused on my position. How's your progress to the extraction point? Morrison's voice came back immediately. We're almost there, Overwatch. Extraction bird is inbound, ETA 2 minutes. What's your situation? I'm mobile and engaging enemy forces, Maria replied, which was technically true even if it didn't capture the full desperation of her circumstances. Continue to the extraction point. Don't wait for me. She could hear Morrison start to object, but she turned down her radio volume and focused on the immediate problem. The enemy flanking force was now less than 100 meters from the extraction point, and Morrison's team would arrive there in about the same time. If those fighters reached the landing zone first, they could set up positions that would make helicopter extraction impossible. Maria had maybe 90 seconds to eliminate or disperse the flanking force before they could establish fire superiority over the extraction point. She checked her remaining ammunition, 12 rounds. It would have to be enough. She waited for a lull in the enemy fire from the ridge, then sprinted from her minimal cover toward the boulder cluster. This time the distance was shorter, but the enemy fire was more accurate. They had her range now and were leading their shots to account for her movement. A bullet struck the rock inches from her hand as she dove behind the largest boulder in the cluster. Another bullet ricocheted off the stone above her head, sending fragments down into her hair. But she was in position now, with clear lines of sight to both the extraction point and the approaching enemy flankers. Through her scope, she could see the flanking force moving through a small ravine that would bring them to within 50 meters of the extraction point. There were at least 8 fighters, all armed with assault rifles and moving with tactical discipline. They knew what they were doing, and they were almost in position to turn the extraction into a massacre. Maria began engaging them systematically, starting with the lead fighters and working her way back through the formation. Her first shot dropped the point man just as he was preparing to climb out of the ravine. The second shot took out the fighter behind him who was trying to provide covering fire. The remaining enemy fighters went to ground in the ravine, but they were trapped in a narrow space with limited cover. Maria could see them trying to find positions that would protect them from her fire, while still allowing them to engage the incoming helicopter and Morrison's team. Her ammunition count dropped to 8 rounds, then 6, then 4 as she systematically eliminated the flanking threat. Each shot had to count now. There was no room for misses or wounding shots that would only force the enemy to take cover. In the distance, she could hear the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors approaching the extraction point. Morrison's team would be there any moment, and the bird would be on the ground for the minimum time possible to avoid being shot down by enemy forces. But the fighters, on the ridge behind her, had used her focus on the flanking force to close the distance to her position. She could hear them moving through the rocks, coordinating their approach as they prepared to assault her boulder cluster from multiple directions. Maria had 3 rounds left, and enemies approaching from 2 different directions. The math was simple and unforgiving. She could maybe take out 3 more targets before being overwhelmed, but there were far more than 3 enemy fighters still in the fight. Her radio crackled with the helicopter pilot's voice. "Alpha Team, this is Extraction Bird. I'm on final approach to your position. Prep for immediate departure." Through her scope, Maria could see Morrison's team reaching the extraction point just as the helicopter flared for landing. Rodriguez and Jackson were loading Chen onto the aircraft while the other team members established a defensive perimeter around the landing zone. The sight of her friends reaching safety filled Maria with a fierce satisfaction, even as enemy fighters closed in on her position from multiple directions. She had done her job. Her team was alive and would make it home to fight another day. Whatever happened to her now was secondary to that primary mission. The helicopter was on the ground for less than 30 seconds before lifting off with Morrison's team safely aboard. Through her scope, Maria watched the aircraft climb rapidly and bank away from the landing zone, carrying her friends to safety. Chen was alive, the mission was complete, and 8 good soldiers would see their families again. But Maria's situation had become desperate. Enemy fighters were now within 50 meters of her position, approaching from 3 different directions. She could hear their boots on the rocks, their voices coordinating the final assault on her boulder cluster. With only 3 rounds remaining, she had to make some hard choices about how to use them. The first enemy fighter appeared around the eastern edge of her cover, rifle raised and ready to fire. Maria's shot took him center mass, dropping him before he could get off a round. 2 bullets left, and at least a dozen enemy fighters still closing in. Voices erupted in excitement from the enemy positions as they realized how close they were to their target. Maria could hear them calling to each other, coordinating their movement to overwhelm her position from multiple angles simultaneously. They had learned from watching their comrades fall to her rifle, and they weren't taking any chances now. Maria shifted position within the boulder cluster, trying to find an angle that would let her engage the most threatening enemy positions with her remaining ammunition. Through gaps in the rocks, she could see fighters moving closer, using every piece of available cover as they closed the distance. Her radio crackled with Morrison's voice from the departing helicopter. "Overwatch, what's your extraction plan? We're not leaving you behind." Maria keyed her mic while keeping her rifle trained on the approaching enemy forces. "Negative, Alpha. Continue your extraction. I'm working on my own exit strategy." It wasn't exactly true, but Morrison had his own team to worry about, and Maria wasn't going to let them risk the helicopter and everyone aboard in a futile rescue attempt. Some situations couldn't be fixed with good intentions and superior firepower. A second enemy fighter appeared at the western edge of her position, trying to coordinate his movement with others who were still approaching. Maria's shot dropped him as well, but now she was down to her final round. 1 bullet left, and the enemy knew exactly where she was. The voices were getting closer now, and Maria could see movement in her peripheral vision as fighters positioned themselves for the final assault. They would come from all directions at once, overwhelming her position through sheer numbers. She had perhaps 30 seconds before they were ready to make their move. Maria made peace with her situation. She had accomplished her mission and saved her team. Everything beyond that was a bonus. She chambered her final round and selected the target that would make the most tactical difference when the assault began. That's when she heard it. The distant sound of helicopter rotors, but coming from a different direction than Morrison's extraction bird had departed. She risked a quick glance skyward and saw a pair of Apache attack helicopters approaching the area at high speed. Her radio exploded with chatter as Morrison's voice came through. "Overwatch. Be advised we have close air support inbound to your position. Apache Flight is requesting your location for immediate fire support." Maria keyed her mic while keeping her rifle trained on the nearest enemy position. "Apache Flight, this is Ground Observer. Enemy forces are within 50 meters of my position, approaching from multiple directions. Coordinates follow." She rattled off her GPS position and the approximate locations of the enemy forces, knowing that the Apache pilots would need precise information to avoid hitting her with their own weapons. The margin for error was measured in meters, and any mistake would be fatal. Through the rocks, she could see the enemy fighters had heard the approaching helicopters and were now trying to decide whether to complete their assault on her position or disperse to avoid the incoming air support. Some continued moving toward her, while others began looking for cover that would protect them from aerial attack. The first Apache appeared over the ridge like an avenging angel, its 30mm chain gun already spinning up for engagement. Maria pressed herself against the rocks as the aircraft opened fire on the enemy positions around her. Cluster of boulders. The sound was overwhelming. A continuous roar of cannon fire mixed with the explosive impacts of high-explosive rounds hitting the rocky terrain. Dust and debris filled the air as the Apache systematically engaged every enemy position within range of Maria's location. Enemy return fire was sporadic and ineffective. The Taliban fighters had weapons designed to engage ground targets, not fast-moving aircraft with sophisticated defensive systems. Within minutes, the coordinated assault on Maria's position had been broken up by devastating accurate fire from the Apache helicopters. But the fight wasn't over yet. Through the dust and smoke, Maria could see surviving enemy fighters attempting to regroup in positions that offered better protection from aerial attack. The Apaches had bought her breathing room, but they couldn't eliminate every threat in the area. Her radio crackled with the Apache flight leader's voice. "Ground Observer, this is Apache Lead. We've suppressed the immediate threats around your position, but we're showing additional enemy movement in the area. Can you move to a better extraction point?" Maria assessed her situation. The immediate assault on her position had been broken up, but there were still enemy fighters in the area, and more could be approaching. The Apache helicopters had limited fuel and ammunition, so they couldn't provide indefinite close air support. She needed to move to a position where a helicopter could safely extract her. But that meant leaving the relative safety of her boulder cluster and crossing open ground while potentially under enemy observation. It was a calculated risk, but staying in place would only delay the inevitable. "Apache Lead, I'm going to move to Extraction Point 2, Maria transmitted, referencing a secondary landing zone they had identified during mission planning. "It's about 600 meters northeast of my current position. I'll need covering fire during movement." "Copy that, Ground Observer. Apache 2 will provide overwatch of your movement route. Apache 1 will continue to suppress enemy positions in the area." Maria gathered her gear and prepared to move. 600 meters of difficult terrain lay between her current position and safety, but it was better than the alternative of waiting for more enemy reinforcements to arrive. She checked her rifle one final time, confirming that her last round was still chambered and ready to fire if needed. The sound of helicopter rotors filled the air as the Apache flight repositioned to provide the best possible coverage of her movement route. Through the rocks, Maria could see the lead aircraft circling the area like a predator, its sensors scanning for any enemy forces that might threaten her escape. Maria left the safety of her boulder cluster and began moving toward the extraction point with practiced stealth. Every step was calculated, every movement designed to minimize her exposure to potential enemy observation. The Apache helicopters circled overhead like guardian angels, their sensors scanning the terrain for any sign of surviving enemy forces. The first 300 meters passed without incident. Maria moved from cover to cover, using the natural terrain to mask her movement while maintaining a steady pace toward the extraction point. The Apache pilots provided running commentary over the radio, updating her on enemy positions and safe routes through the rocky landscape. Halfway to her destination, Maria's radio crackled with a transmission that made her blood run cold. Ground observer, this is Apache lead. We're showing a large enemy force approaching from the north, approximately 2 kilometers out. Multiple vehicles, estimated company strength. You need to move faster. A company-sized enemy force meant over 100 fighters, possibly more. They would be heavily armed and motivated by the destruction of their ambush force. Maria had maybe 10 minutes before they reached the area, and she was still 300 meters from the extraction point. She abandoned stealth for speed, moving as quickly as the terrain would allow, while still maintaining some tactical awareness of her surroundings. Behind her, she could hear the Apaches engaging new targets as the first elements of the enemy. Reinforcements came within range of their weapons systems. The extraction point was a small clearing on a ridge that offered good helicopter landing zones but limited defensive positions. As Maria approached it, she could see why it had been chosen as a secondary site. It was tactically vulnerable but offered fast access for extraction aircraft. Her radio crackled with a new voice. Ground observer. This is Rescue 6-1. I'm inbound to your position for immediate extraction. ETA 3 minutes. Be ready for fast pickup. Maria reached the extraction point and immediately began scanning the surrounding area for defensive positions. If the enemy reached this location before the rescue helicopter arrived, she would need every advantage she could get. Her single remaining bullet would be essentially useless against a large enemy force. The Apaches were now engaged in continuous combat with the approaching enemy reinforcements. Through the sound of their cannon fire, Maria could hear the distinctive crack of enemy anti-aircraft weapons. The Taliban had learned to bring surface-to-air missiles to engagements with American forces, and the Apache pilots were having to use increasingly aggressive tactics to avoid being shot down. Apache lead. This is ground observer, Maria transmitted. Recommend you pull back to safe distance. I can handle the extraction from here. Negative, ground observer. We're staying until your wheel's up. Through the trees, Maria could see the first enemy vehicles reaching the base of the ridge. They were moving fast, trying to get troops in position before the rescue helicopter could reach her. Fighters were dismounting from trucks and beginning to climb toward her position on foot. The sound of approaching helicopter rotors announced the arrival of Rescue 6-1, a Black Hawk flying fast and low through the valleys to avoid enemy fire. Maria could see the aircraft approaching from the south, its pilots using the terrain to mask their approach until the last possible moment. But the enemy had seen it too. Maria watched anti-aircraft missiles streak skyward from multiple positions as the Taliban fighters tried to bring down the rescue helicopter before it could reach her position. The Black Hawk's defensive systems activated, deploying flares and chaff while the pilots maneuvered aggressively to avoid the incoming missiles. One missile detonated close enough to the helicopter to shower it with debris, but the aircraft continued its approach. Maria could see battle damage on the fuselage as it flared for landing in the small clearing, but the pilots maintained control and brought it down safely. Get in, shouted the crew chief as the helicopter touched down. Maria sprinted toward the aircraft, her rifle still ready in case enemy fighters appeared in the tree line around the clearing. Just as she reached the helicopter's door, the first enemy fighters crested the ridge and opened fire on the extraction. Bullets sparked off the Black Hawk's armor plating and cracked through the air around Maria's head as she dove into the aircraft. Go, 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 she shouted to the pilots as the crew chief hauled her fully inside the helicopter. The Black Hawk lifted off immediately, climbing rapidly as enemy fire erupted from multiple positions around the landing zone. More anti-aircraft missiles streaked upward. But the pilots had expected this and were already executing evasive maneuvers that turned Maria's stomach, but kept them alive. Through the helicopter's window, Maria could see the Apache helicopters continuing to engage the enemy forces on the ridge, buying time for the Black Hawk to clear the area safely. Their dedication to protecting her escape filled her with gratitude and pride in the soldiers who had risked everything to bring her home. As the helicopter gained altitude and distance from the battlefield, Maria finally allowed herself to relax. She was alive, her team was safe, and the mission had been accomplished despite overwhelming odds. Chen would recover from his wounds, and 8 good soldiers would return home to their families. The crew chief handed her a headset so she could communicate over the helicopter's intercom system. "Hell of a thing you did back there," he said. "Intel says you took out at least 15 enemy fighters and saved your whole team." Maria shook her head. "I just did my job, same as everyone else out there." But even as she said it, Maria knew this mission would stay with her forever. not because of the enemies she had killed or the bullets she had dodged, but because of the moment when she had watched Morrison's team safely board their extraction helicopter. That sight, her friends alive and heading home, made every risk worthwhile. As the Black Hawk flew toward the forward operating base, Maria thought about the village where it had all started. The enemy had planned their ambush carefully, positioning snipers and reinforcements to create an inescapable trap. They had whispered among themselves about the American patrol approaching their killing zone, confident that they would add 8 more names to their list of victories. But they had made one critical mistake. They had forgotten to account for the guardian angel watching over her friends from the ridgeline above. Maria Santos, the girl from Texas who had learned to shoot hunting deer with her grandfather, had proven once again that American soldiers never fight alone. The helicopter carrying Morrison's team had already reached base safely, and Maria could see it on the landing pad as they approached. Her friends were alive, and that was all that mattered. Everything else was just details that would be sorted out in the after-action reports and medal citations that would follow. As Rescue 6-1 touched down at the base, Maria gathered her gear and prepared to rejoin her team. There would be debriefings and medical checks, equipment maintenance and mission planning for the next operation. But for now, she was just grateful to be alive and heading home with all her people accounted for. The enemy had murmured among themselves about who was pursuing them, never realizing that sometimes the hunter becomes the hunted, and that American soldiers never leave their own behind.